Welcome to the deep dive. Ever felt like you're trying to drink from a fire hose when learning something new? Today we're diving into the science behind that feeling cognitive load theory. Think of it as understanding how your brain's short-term memory works when tackling new info, and how we can make that process smoother, not, overwhelming.
Exactly. And we're basing this deep dive on a really influential paper from, well, back in 1998 by John Sweller, Jaron Van Marienboer, and Fred Paz. It's called Cognitive Architecture and Instructional Design.
Right.
And this isn't just like dry theory. It's actually full of practical insights. Stuff that can help you understand why some ways of learning just click, while others leave you feeling, well, completely lost.
Mm-hmm.
So our goal today is to pull out those key ideas so you can understand how learning works under the hood, and maybe even spot ways to make your own learning or how information is presented to you more effective.
Yeah, our mission today is really to get to the heart of this paper so you can grasp the fundamental mechanics of learning. We want to give you a framework for understanding why sometimes new information flows easily and other times it feels like your brain has just hit a brick wall. So let's kick things off by looking at how our minds are structured to handle information, according to this theory.
Okay, so the foundation of cognitive load theory is basically a model of how we process information. It starts with what we call working memory. That's essentially your conscious awareness, right? The space where you're actively thinking about things right now.
Okay.
And the crucial thing to understand is that this working memory is very limited, really limited in what it can handle at any one time.
Limited how? I vaguely recall something about a magic number of items, like 7.
Yeah, you're probably thinking of George Miller's famous 7 plus or minus 2 paper from 1956.
Right.
And while that's kind of a handy rule of thumb, a more practical way to think about it based on later research is that we can probably only actively process around 2 or 3 new pieces of information simultaneously.
Only 2 or 3. Wow.
Yeah. And it's not just about holding on to them. It's the mental work,
Right.
organizing, comparing, really engaging with that information. That's what creates the bottleneck.
Mhm.
Imagine trying to juggle more than, say, 3 new balls at once. It quickly becomes chaotic.
Okay, so when we're faced with too many new ideas all at once, our mental juggling act starts to fail.
Precisely. And this very limited working memory is in stark contrast to our long-term memory.
Okay.
We're not directly conscious of everything stored there,
Mm.
but it's effectively limitless. It holds all our accumulated knowledge, skills, experiences, really, the bedrock of our intelligence. Think of it like the vast storage on your computer versus the small amount of RAM it can actively use at any moment.
That's a great analogy. We have this tiny mental desktop for what we're actively working on, but a gigantic hard drive in the background.
Exactly. And the interplay between these two, it's really brought into focus when we look at experts in different fields. Consider chess grandmasters. This was studied by de Groot back in the 60s, and then later work by Chase and Simon in the 70s.
Right.
You might assume they have these extraordinary working memories to keep track of all those possible moves on the board.
Right, you'd naturally think they're just processing a much larger amount of information in their heads at once, like some kind of superpower.
But the research revealed something quite surprising. Grandmasters didn't actually consider a significantly greater number of possible moves than less experienced players.
Really?
Yeah. The key difference was their recall of actual game positions. Show them a board from a real match for just a few seconds, and they could practically reconstruct the entire thing perfectly.
Wow.
However, if you showed them a random, nonsensical arrangement of pieces, their recall was no better than a novice's.
Ah, interesting. So it's not about having a better working memory then.
Exactly. It tells us it's not about some innate superpower of working memory.
So what was the secret to their expertise?
It boils down to the vast amount of knowledge they've built up in their long-term memory. Through years and years of dedicated practice,
Okay.
they've developed the ability to recognize thousands upon thousands of typical board configurations. When they encounter a familiar pattern, they don't need to consciously reason through every possible move in their working memory.
Right, they just see it.
They instantly recognize the situation and the strong moves associated with it. It's all about pattern recognition, drawing on that massive reservoir of long-term memory.
So the key takeaway is that becoming an expert isn't about having a superpowered brain in the moment, but about building up this vast library of knowledge and experience in your long-term memory through, well, lots of practice.
Precisely. Novices, in contrast, when faced with a problem, they often have to rely on general problem-solving strategies within their limited working memory because they haven't yet built up that domain-specific knowledge.
Right, they're starting from scratch each time, almost.
Kind of, yeah. And as we've discussed, working memory isn't really designed for handling complex reasoning with lots of unfamiliar elements. This often leads to cognitive overload and difficulty in learning.
Makes sense.
So the implication for how we teach and learn is pretty clear.
Mhm.
We should prioritize helping learners build that crucial domain-specific knowledge in their long-term memory, rather than just focusing on general reasoning skills in isolation.
Okay, so that leads us nicely into the concept of schemas, right? This is how that wealth of knowledge in our long-term memory is organized.
Exactly. Schema theory, outlined by Chai, Glaser, and Rees in their 1982 work, proposes that our long-term memory stores knowledge in the form of schemas. Think of a schema as like a mental framework or a blueprint.
Okay.
It categorizes information based on how we're likely to use it. It's like having, well-organized folders on your computer's hard drive.
Can you give us a concrete example of a schema?
Sure. Think about your schema for dog.
Yeah.
You can recognize countless different breeds, right? Even though they vary widely in size, shape, color.
Right.
Your dog schema contains the essential features: 4 legs, fur, a tail, barking, usually, and how these features typically relate to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Or consider your schema for ordering food at a restaurant. It includes understanding the menu, placing your order, waiting, eating, paying. You access this schema every time you go to a restaurant without having to consciously think through every single step.
So schemas are like mental shortcuts. They help us make sense of the world and act efficiently.
That's a great way to put it. And these schemas, they aren't just passively stored. They're actively built and refined through our experiences.
Mhm.
Learning to read, as the paper points out, is a perfect illustration.
How so?
Well, we start by building schemas for individual letters. Then we combine those into schemas for words, and then words into phrases, sentences, and so on. It's a bottom-up, constructive process of building increasingly complex and interconnected knowledge structures.
Got it. And what are the key advantages of having these well-developed schemas?
2 major benefits. First, as we've touched on, they allow us to organize and store vast amounts of information efficiently in long-term memory.
Okay.
But perhaps even more crucially for learning, they significantly reduce the load on our working memory.
Oh, okay. How does that work?
A well-formed schema, even if it encompasses a huge amount of detailed information, can be treated as a single coherent chunk or element within our limited working memory.
Like zipping a file.
Exactly. Think of it like zipping a large folder on your computer.
Yeah.
It still contains all the files, but it's now a single manageable entity. So these schemas are like mental compression algorithms, taking lots of detailed information and packaging it into a single manageable unit for our working memory.
So instead of having to consciously consider every single detail of, say, a birthday party, the cake, the presents, the singing, all the social stuff, our birthday party schema lets us process the whole event as one manageable idea.
Precisely. Think about how effortlessly you understand the concept of attending a birthday party. That's because your birthday party schema is so well established. All those underlying details are still there in your long-term memory, but they don't require conscious processing in your working memory anymore.
Right.
If you had to actively think about every single element individually, it would quickly overwhelm you. Therefore, schema construction is really about increasing the amount of information we can effectively handle by reducing the number of individual pieces our working memory has to juggle simultaneously. The authors argue this should be a primary aim of education and training.
Okay, so we build these knowledge frameworks, these schemas, over time, but the paper also discusses something called schema automation. What's the difference between just having a schema and having an automated one?
Yeah, that's a crucial distinction. Schema automation is the process of making the use of a schema more and more efficient. So it requires significantly less conscious effort and consumes fewer working memory resources. Think about the difference between conscious and automatic processing. This was explored by Schneider and Schifrin back in the late 70s. Conscious processing happens in our working memory and is subject to all the limitations we've discussed.
Right, the bottleneck.
Exactly. Automatic processing, on the other hand, largely bypasses working memory. It's fast, effortless, and often happens outside of our direct awareness.
It's like when you're first learning a new language and you have to consciously think about every word and grammatical rule. But after years of practice, you can speak and understand fluently without that deliberate mental effort.
That's a perfect analogy for schema automation.
Yeah.
It develops through extensive and consistent practice. With enough repetition, a skill or a process that initially required significant conscious attention can become highly automated.
Meaning it can be carried out with minimal conscious effort.
Right, freeing up valuable working memory resources for other tasks. The paper uses the reading example again. As adults, we don't consciously process each individual letter to read a word. That process became highly automated during childhood.
Mm.
But for a child just learning to read, each letter requires deliberate conscious attention and effort.
So things that initially take up a lot of our mental bandwidth eventually become like background processes that we don't even have to actively think about.
Precisely. And the power of this automation in problem solving was highlighted by Kotowski, Hayes, and Simon in the 80s. They looked at what they called isomorphic problems, problems with the same underlying structure but different surface details.
Okay.
They found that problems involving familiar, automated rules could be solved up to 16 times faster and with significantly less error than structurally identical problems that involved unfamiliar rules.
16 times faster. Wow, that's huge.
It is. This dramatic difference was attributed to the working memory freed up by the automated rules. If the rules weren't automatic, problem solvers had to dedicate most of their limited working memory just to remembering and applying the rules, leaving very little capacity for actually understanding and solving the core problem.
That's incredible. It really underscores how automation is a key step in moving from being a novice to becoming an expert.
Absolutely. When a schema becomes highly automated, like instantly recognizing how to rearrange a basic algebraic equation, you don't have to consciously walk through each step in your working memory.
Right.
That freed up mental space can then be used to tackle more complex aspects of the problem, or to understand the underlying concepts more deeply. Similarly, if your word recognition during reading is automated, you can focus your conscious attention on comprehending the meaning of the text rather than struggling with individual words.
Gotcha.
Later work by Van Marienboer emphasized that effective instructional design should actively promote both the construction of useful schemas and the automation of those schemas for frequently used aspects of a task.
Okay, so we have this picture of how our brains are structured. Limited working memory, vast long-term memory storing schemas, which can become automated through practice. Now, how does all of this connect with cognitive load theory itself and how we should design, effective learning experiences?
Right. Cognitive load theory essentially provides a framework for understanding how instructional design can either support or hinder learning by considering the demands it places on our working memory.
Okay.
If the cognitive load imposed by instruction is too high for our limited working memory capacity, we just won't be able to process the information effectively. And the crucial process of schema construction in long-term memory will be significantly hampered.
Makes sense.
The theory identifies three primary types of cognitive load that are at play during learning.
All right, let's break these down. What's the first type?
The first type is what we call intrinsic cognitive load. This load is inherent to the complexity of the material itself. Specifically, it's determined by what's known as element interactivity.
Element interactivity. What does that mean exactly?
It refers to the number of elements that need to be processed simultaneously in working memory in order to understand the material. Think of it as the inherent difficulty woven into the fabric of the subject matter.
Okay. Can you give us a clearer idea of high versus low element interactivity?
Certainly. Learning pairs of words and their definitions, for example, like studying vocabulary in a new language, typically has low element interactivity. You can learn that agua means water relatively independently of other vocabulary words or grammatical rules.
Right, you can learn them one by one.
Pretty much, yeah. Each word-meaning pairing can be learned more or less in isolation. However, trying to learn the grammar of that same language has high element interactivity.
Oh, huh?
The rules governing word order, verb conjugations, noun declensions, they all interact with each other. You can't really learn one in isolation without understanding its relationship to the others. Understanding requires holding and processing multiple interacting elements at the same time.
So it's like trying to understand all the interconnected parts of a complex machine versus learning the names of the individual tools in a toolbox.
That's a good way to think about it. Mathematical concepts often fall into this category of high element interactivity.
Yeah.
Consider learning to solve an equation like x plus yz for xa. To truly understand why you perform each step, multiplying by z, then subtracting g, you need to simultaneously consider the principles of algebraic manipulation, the concept of equality, how each operation affects the different parts. These elements are highly interactive.
Right, you can't just learn them as isolated steps.
Exactly. Not if you want to grasp the underlying logic. For someone who hasn't yet developed a strong schema for algebraic manipulation, the intrinsic cognitive load of such a problem can be very high.
Mm-hmm.
The paper points out that genuine understanding often occurs when material with high element interactivity can be held and processed simultaneously in working memory, and this is often facilitated by existing schemas that allow us to group these interacting elements into more manageable chunks.
And this intrinsic load changes depending on how much you already know.
Yeah, exactly. The level of intrinsic load isn't fixed. It's influenced by the learner's prior knowledge and expertise. What presents a high degree of interactivity for a novice might be relatively low for an expert who already has well-developed schemas in that domain.
Okay, so intrinsic load is about the inherent complexity. What's the second type of cognitive load?
The second type is extraneous cognitive load. This is the cognitive load imposed by poorly designed instruction, and it doesn't contribute to learning the material itself. It's essentially mental effort wasted on dealing with confusing layouts, unclear instructions, or having to mentally integrate information that's presented in a disjointed way. Sweller defined this formally back in '94.
Ah, so this is the bad kind of load, the unnecessary stuff.
You could say that, yeah. Think of it as unnecessary mental clutter that gets in the way of actual learning.
So things like having to constantly switch between a diagram on one page and the text explaining it on another, or trying to decipher poorly organized information.
Precisely. Anything in the way the information is presented or the tasks learners are asked to do that doesn't directly support understanding the inherent complexity of the topic contributes to extraneous load. We'll encounter some specific examples of this later, like the split attention effect. The goal of good instructional design is really to minimize this unnecessary load.
Okay, makes sense. And what about the third type?
The third type is germane cognitive load. This represents the mental effort that is actually devoted to learning and building schemas. It's the productive cognitive work, the deep processing that directly contributes to the development of understanding and the acquisition of new knowledge in long-term memory.
So this is the good kind of load, the effort that actually leads to learning.
That's right. Effective instructional design aims to minimize extraneous load so that more of our limited working memory capacity can be allocated to this crucial germane load, the active construction of those useful knowledge structures.
So it's about clearing away the mental obstacles created by bad teaching so we can focus on the real work of understanding and building knowledge.
Exactly. The ultimate goal is to reduce extraneous load as much as possible and, within the constraints of working memory capacity, to optimize germane load, the mental effort that leads to lasting learning, the development of robust schemas, and ultimately the acquisition of expertise.
This all provides a really helpful framework. But how do we actually go about measuring this cognitive load? It's not something you can directly observe, is it?
You're absolutely right. It's not something you can easily put a number on directly. The paper discusses various approaches researchers have used. Initially, a lot of the research relied on indirect measures, things like looking at learning times or error rates on tasks.
Okay.
For instance, if one instructional method consistently led to faster learning or fewer errors on subsequent transfer tasks compared to another method, it was often inferred that the more effective method imposed a lower cognitive load.
Right. Makes sense.
Sweller's early work also used computational modeling to simulate cognitive processes and explore the impact of different strategies. Another technique involved using secondary tasks.
Secondary tasks, how do those provide insight into cognitive load?
Well, the underlying idea is that if a learner's working memory is heavily burdened by the primary learning task, they'll have fewer cognitive resources available to dedicate to the secondary task, which is usually something simple. So their performance on that secondary task is likely to suffer. It's sort of like trying to have a complex conversation while simultaneously trying to solve a difficult mental math problem. The harder the math, the harder it is to focus on the conversation.
Yeah, definitely.
So poor performance on the secondary task is often interpreted as an indication of a higher cognitive load imposed by the primary learning activity.
That makes sense. If your mental resources are stretched thin by the main task, you'll have less capacity for anything else.
Precisely.
Yeah.
However, in more recent years, researchers have also increasingly employed more direct measures, particularly subjective self-report ratings.
Just asking people how hard they're thinking.
Pretty much. Fred Pales and Jeroen van Marienboer developed various rating scales where learners were asked to report on their perceived level of mental effort during or after a learning task.
And does that actually work?
Surprisingly well, it seems. Their research has shown that these subjective measures can be quite sensitive to differences in instructional design, they're generally reliable, and they're relatively non-intrusive for the learners. It appears people are often reasonably good at reflecting on and reporting how much mental effort they're expending.
That's quite fascinating. So, simply asking someone how hard they felt they were thinking can actually provide valuable data.
The evidence suggests it can be a useful and informative measure, yeah, especially when comparing the cognitive load associated with different instructional techniques or learning conditions. There's also been some exploration into using physiological measures, like heart rate variability or brain activity monitoring. But the paper mentions subjective rating scales have generally proven more practical and reliable for much of this research.
Okay. And how do researchers use these measurements then to actually compare the effectiveness of different teaching methods?
That's where the concept of instructional efficiency comes into play. Payas van Marienboer developed a method to integrate measures of mental effort with measures of learning performance.
Okay, so combining effort and results.
Exactly. By looking at both how much mental effort learners are investing and how well they are actually learning, often measured through post-tests or transfer tasks, you get a much more comprehensive picture of how efficient a particular instructional approach is.
How do they do that?
They often use standardized scores, like z-scores, to make the effort and performance data comparable. Sometimes they plot these on a graph, allowing for a visual comparison. For instance, the geometry problem-solving example they mentioned showed how learning from worked examples could lead to both better performance and lower reported mental effort compared to traditional problem-solving practice.
Indicating higher instructional efficiency for the worked examples in that case.
Right, so it's not just about whether someone can learn something, but also about the mental cost involved in that learning process. A more instructionally efficient method achieves better learning outcomes with a lower investment of mental effort.
Got it. So it's not just about whether someone learned something, but also about how much mental strain it took them to get there. A more efficient method gets you better results with less effort.
Exactly. Now that we have this foundational understanding of cognitive architecture, the different types of load and how we can try to measure it, we can move on to explore some of the specific instructional procedures that have been developed and studied through the lens of cognitive load theory.
All right.
The paper discusses several key effects that have emerged. Let's start by looking at the goal-free effect.
Goal-free. That sounds a little counterintuitive, doesn't it? Especially when we're trying to learn something specific with a clear objective in mind.
It certainly does seem counterintuitive at first glance, yeah.
Yeah.
The central idea behind goal-free problems, which Sweller explored back in '88, is to actually reduce the extraneous cognitive load that can be associated with conventional problem solving.
Especially when you're just starting out.
Exactly, especially in the initial stages of learning when learners haven't yet developed well-established schemas for that type of problem. In a typical problem-solving scenario, you're given a starting state and a specific goal, right?
Yeah.
And you naturally engage in what's called means-ends analysis, constantly comparing where you are now to the goal and trying to figure out steps to reduce the difference.
Right, like working backwards sometimes.
Kind of. And while this approach is often effective for reaching the solution, the process of constantly evaluating the difference between your current state and the goal, that can actually place a significant burden on your working memory. It might not be the most efficient way to learn the underlying principles and build useful schemas.
Can you give us a more concrete example? The paper mentioned a kinematics problem about motion.
Sure. A standard kinematics problem might say, a car accelerates from rest at 2 meters per second squared for 10 seconds. What is the final velocity?
Okay.
To solve this, you'd identify the goal, final velocity, the givens, initial velocity, acceleration, time, and then search your memory for the right kinematic equation that links these variables. This involves holding all that info in working memory, comparing your no-answer state to the final velocity goal, and selecting the relevant formula.
So quite a bit of mental juggling involved, keeping track of everything and trying to find the right formula. What would a goal-free version look like?
A goal-free version would give the same initial info. A car accelerates from rest at 2 meter sots for 10 seconds. But instead of asking for a specific value like final velocity, it would ask something like, calculate the values of as many variables as you can.
Ah, interesting. Just find whatever you can.
Yeah. This seemingly small change fundamentally alters the cognitive processes involved. By removing the specific goal, you eliminate the need for constant means-ends analysis. Learners are instead encouraged to explore the relationships between the given variables and apply any relevant formulas or principles they know to calculate any related quantities.
So, the surprising takeaway is that by removing the pressure of a specific target, we actually free up our minds to learn the bigger picture more effectively.
It seems so.
Hmm.
And the research, starting with Sweller and Levine's work in '82, and continuing with studies in kinematics, geometry, trigonometry, even biology, it's consistently shown that learning through solving goal-free problems can actually lead to the development of more flexible and generalizable schemas compared to traditional goal-oriented problem solving, especially for novices.
Hmm.
Even though the learner might end up calculating the same values, the cognitive processes they engage in are different. Without the constant pressure of comparing progress to a specific goal, they're more likely to focus on understanding the fundamental relationships between problem states and the operators that can be applied.
Which is exactly what builds those robust schemas.
Exactly. The extraneous cognitive load associated with that goal-directed search process is reduced, allowing more cognitive resources to be devoted to understanding the underlying principles.
So sometimes taking away the explicit goal can actually lead to more effective learning of the underlying concepts in the long run. That's a really powerful and somewhat unexpected idea. What's the next instructional procedure highlighted?
The next really important effect is the worked example effect. This is another finding that often goes against our intuitive belief that actively solving problems ourselves is always the best way to learn.
Okay. What's a worked example?
As the name implies, it presents the learner with a problem statement, along with a complete, step-by-step solution already provided.
So instead of grappling with the problem yourself, you're essentially shown the complete answer and how to get there.
Correct. And the surprising finding, supported by a large body of research across diverse domains, algebra, statistics, geometry, even computer programming, is that studying well-designed worked examples can often lead to better schema construction and improved performance on subsequent transfer problems compared to actually solving the equivalent problems yourself.
Better than doing it yourself. That is counterintuitive.
It really is, especially during the initial phases of learning a new type of problem. We often strongly associate learning with active engagement in independent problem solving.
Right. So why would simply looking at a solution be more effective than the active struggle of figuring it out?
The key reason, according to the theory, is that studying worked examples directs the learner's limited working memory resources towards understanding the problem states and the correct sequence of solution steps.
Oh.
It lets you see how an expert approaches the problem, the rationale behind each step, the overall structure. This can significantly facilitate the development of a well-organized, efficient schema for that type of problem.
Whereas trying to solve it yourself from scratch might involve a lot of that inefficient means-ends analysis again.
Exactly. When you're actively trying to solve a novel problem, especially if you lack a schema, you often rely heavily on means-ends analysis. And as we've seen, that search process can place a very high load on working memory, consuming resources that could otherwise be used for actually learning the principles and building the schema.
So worked examples cut down on that extraneous load.
Right. They essentially eliminate the initial, often inefficient search process. You're directly presented with an effective strategy, allowing you to focus on understanding the why behind each step rather than just the what. The paper even mentions some long-term studies, like those by Zhu and Simon, suggesting that in certain contexts, learning primarily through studying worked examples can be surprisingly effective. It might even replace traditional classroom teaching for initial skill acquisition in some cases.
Wow, that's a pretty powerful statement about the potential of worked examples. But are there any potential downsides or limitations? Should we just stop solving problems?
No, definitely not. The paper does acknowledge potential drawbacks to exclusive use of worked examples. Over-reliance might lead to reduced motivation for some or a more passive approach.
Right.
It could also potentially hinder the development of creative problem-solving skills in the long run if learners don't eventually transition to active problem-solving practice.
And the quality of the example matters, I assume?
Absolutely crucial. They need to be clear, well-structured, and avoid elements that could introduce other kinds of extraneous load, like the split attention effect, which we'll get to.
Okay, so worked examples are a valuable tool, especially early on, but they shouldn't be the only strategy. There needs to be a balance leading to independent problem solving.
Precisely. And that brings us nicely to the completion problem effect. This technique can be seen as a sort of bridge between studying fully worked examples and doing conventional independent problem solving.
A bridge. How does that work?
A completion problem gives you the problem statement, the goal state, and a solution that is partially worked out. Certain steps or elements are missing for the learner to complete.
Ah, okay. So you're not given the entire answer, but you get enough of a scaffold to guide you.
Exactly. This approach, championed by Van Marienborn and Kramer, aims to combine the benefits of seeing a worked-out solution with the active cognitive engagement of problem solving.
So you still have to think it through.
Right. You still need to actively process the information provided and apply your understanding to fill in the missing steps and complete the solution. Research by Pies in statistics showed that learning through completion problems, similar to work examples, can lead to better transfer and lower reported mental effort compared to conventional problems initially.
It's interesting.
And Van Marienbor's longer-term studies in computer programming found completion problems were particularly effective for learning program construction skills and helped learners acquire programming templates or patterns.
That sounds like a really effective way to encourage more active processing while still providing support to manage cognitive load. Kind of the best of both worlds.
It has that potential, yes. It can reduce the extraneous load associated with getting completely stuck on a novel problem, while still requiring learners to actively engage with the solution process and build their own understanding and schemas.
Are there any catches?
Well, the paper also points out that designing effective completion problems can be quite challenging. You need to carefully consider which parts to provide and which parts to leave out in a way that promotes meaningful understanding without being so difficult it leads to overwhelming frustration and cognitive overload.
Right, finding that sweet spot. Okay, we've explored goal-free problems, worked examples, and completion problems, all strategies that seem to manage the cognitive demands of problem solving in different ways. What's the next important concept?
Next, we're going to discuss a very significant concept called the split attention effect. This powerfully demonstrates how the specific format in which instructional information is presented can have a substantial impact on cognitive load and learning, even if the core content is exactly the same.
Format matters. How so?
The split attention effect occurs when learners are required to mentally integrate information from multiple sources that are physically or temporally separated in order to make sense of the material.
Oh, I think I've definitely experienced that frustration. It's like trying to follow instructions that keep referring to a diagram on a completely different page, forcing you to flip back and forth, mentally or physically.
That's a classic and very common example of split attention in action. The paper itself uses the geometry problem example. A diagram illustrating the problem is in one place, and the corresponding solution steps and explanations are given as separate blocks of text elsewhere.
Right.
To understand how a step relates to the diagram, the learner has to read the text, hold that info in working memory, then visually search the diagram to find the relevant parts. This process of mentally integrating the disparate pieces, it imposes a significant extraneous cognitive load.
So mental effort that isn't actually helping you learn the geometry.
Exactly. It's mental effort consumed just by the act of trying to connect the separated sources. Our precious working memory capacity is being used to just trying to bridge the gap between the pieces instead of focusing on processing the actual geometrical content.
And the solution is pretty obvious when you think about it.
It is, often. The solution, as the paper illustrates with what they call the integrated format, is to physically combine the related information directly. In the geometry example, this means embedding the labels, annotations, and references directly within the diagram itself.
So you don't have to do that mental bridging.
Right. By physically integrating the related sources, you significantly reduce the need for mental integration and thus lower the extraneous cognitive load. And there's a substantial body of research across various domains: geometry, kinematics, coordinate geometry, even learning from animations, providing strong evidence for this effect and the benefits of integrated formats.
Interesting. Does it matter how complex the material is?
Yes. Interestingly, research has shown the split attention effect tends to be more pronounced when the material has high element interactivity, which we discussed earlier.
Ah, because your working memory is already under strain.
Exactly. When intrinsic load is high, adding extraneous load from split attention is particularly detrimental.
It sounds like a relatively simple fix in many cases, just putting related information closer together, but one that can make a surprisingly big difference.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, split attention is a very common issue in many instructional materials, textbooks, online courses, you name it. So simply being aware of this effect and actively trying to minimize it can really lead to more effective learning experiences. Now, building on this idea of presentation format, let's move on to discuss modality effects.
Modality.
Yeah.
As in the different senses we use, like auditory versus visual.
Exactly. Research in cognitive psychology, particularly work by Badley and Penny on working memory, suggests our working memory has partially independent processing channels for visual and auditory information.
Okay, like separate streams.
Sort of, yeah. The modality effect, which often arises in situations where split attention might otherwise occur, proposes that we can leverage both of these channels to effectively increase our overall working memory capacity when dealing with certain types of information.
How does that work in practice?
Consider a situation where you need to integrate info, like a visual diagram that needs accompanying verbal explanations. If you present both the diagram and the explanation as written text separately, leading to split attention, you risk overloading the visual processing channel.
Right, trying to read and look at the same time.
Exactly. The modality effects suggest you can often reduce this load by presenting the explanatory text in auditory form as spoken narration, for example, while the learner continues to view the visual diagram.
Ah, so using both ears and eyes separately.
Right. You're utilizing the auditory working memory channel for the verbal info and the visual channel for the diagram, rather than overloading just the visual channel. Research by Musavi, Lowe, and Sweller in geometry and others in electrical engineering have provided support for this.
What did they find?
They found that instruction combining auditory explanations with visual diagrams can be significantly more effective than instruction presenting both visually under split attention conditions, especially when the material has high element interactivity. Learners even reported lower subjective cognitive load with the audio-visual approach.
So, hearing the explanation while looking at the relevant visual can be less mentally demanding and lead to better understanding than reading the same explanation while trying to make sense of the visual.
Precisely. By presenting information across different modalities, auditory and visual, in this case, you can free up resources within each channel and use the dual channel capacity of working memory more effectively. This has significant practical implications for designing multimedia learning materials, obviously.
Okay, so integrated visuals are good, and using both audio and visual channels can also help manage load, especially when integration is needed. Now, what happens when we have multiple sources of information that are essentially saying the same thing? It seems like that might be helpful for reinforcement.
Ah, that brings us to the redundancy effect, and this is another area where our intuitive assumptions can sometimes lead us astray.
Oh, how so?
While split attention deals with integrating separate but essential pieces, the redundancy effect occurs when you have multiple sources that are self-contained and don't require integration because they essentially convey the exact same information in different formats. The seminal work here was by Chandler and Sweller in '91.
Okay, give me an example.
Think of a detailed diagram showing blood flow through the heart, accompanied by a separate, complete textual description that explains exactly what's visually depicted, using pretty much the same vocabulary and level of detail.
So the learner gets the same core information twice, once visually, once in words. You might think that repetition would strengthen understanding, right?
Exactly, that's the common intuition. However, research has consistently shown that, under certain conditions, presenting this kind of redundant information can actually increase extraneous cognitive load and hinder learning rather than helping it,
Hinder it. Why?
because the learner's brain still has to process both sources. Even though they convey the same message, the learner expends cognitive resources attending to and processing both the diagram and the redundant text. This extra processing doesn't contribute to deeper understanding and can actually interfere with processing the essential information.
So it's just more clutter for the working memory.
Pretty much. Chanley and Sweller's research found that in many cases, the most effective approach is simply to eliminate the redundant information and present the essential info in a single, well-designed format.
That's surprising. I would have assumed that more information, especially presented in different ways, would always be beneficial.
Not necessarily, especially if the additional information isn't adding anything new and just requires extra processing. There's been considerable research supporting this across various contexts: paper folding, computer manuals, even early literacy instruction. They found adding pictures that directly illustrated words could sometimes hinder learning.
Wow. Does it depend on the learner at all?
Yes, that's an important nuance. Later research, like by Kaluga, Chandler, and Sweller, showed an interaction with expertise. Information that's redundant and unhelpful for a more knowledgeable learner might actually be necessary scaffolding for a novice who's still struggling to understand the core concepts in just one format.
Ah, so a beginner might need the text to understand the diagram, but an expert doesn't.
Exactly, which highlights the importance of considering prior knowledge and suggests the need for adaptive instruction. But the core idea remains. Be wary of unnecessary repetition. The paper notes the redundancy effect is counterintuitive and has been rediscovered multiple times, probably because our gut feeling is often that more info is better.
So the takeaway is to be mindful of not just avoiding splitting essential information, but also avoiding overloading learners with unnecessary redundant information that clutters working memory.
Precisely. Now, for our final instructional procedure from cognitive load theory, let's discuss the variability effect. This examines how varying the conditions of practice influences learning, and particularly the transfer of that learning to new situations.
I've heard about varied practice in learning motor skills, like different basketball shots, but how does it apply to cognitive learning, like understanding concepts?
The underlying principle is quite similar. Variability of practice, practicing different versions of a task or applying a concept in various contexts, has consistently been shown to improve the transfer of learning. That's your ability to apply what you've learned to novel problems or situations you haven't seen before.
Okay.
Studies by Quiligi and Mayer on statistics word problems and work by Jelsma and Bilstra on troubleshooting complex systems provide good examples. By encountering a concept or problem-solving approach in different ways, you develop a more flexible, robust schema that isn't tied to specific surface features.
You get better at seeing the underlying principle.
Exactly. You become better at identifying the core ideas and distinguishing relevant from irrelevant info across different situations.
So instead of just practicing the exact same type of math problem over and over, it's better in the long run to mix it up with slightly different variations.
Generally, yes. However, initial research on variability sometimes seem to contradict cognitive load theory principles.
How so?
Because while high variability often led to better transfer later, it could also increase cognitive load during the practice sessions themselves. This apparent contradiction was sometimes called the transfer paradox.
Harder practice leads to better long-term learning.
Kind of. Pocahontas and Van Marienboer reinterpreted this using cognitive load theory, distinguishing between extraneous and germane load. They propose that variability primarily increases germane cognitive load, the effort directed at building more adaptable schemas.
The good kind of load.
Right. And that's beneficial for long-term learning and transfer when extraneous cognitive load is kept relatively low.
Okay, so there's a catch.
Exactly. If extraneous load is already high, due to poor design or complex initial problems, then adding more variability might simply overload working memory, hindering both immediate learning and future transfer.
So you need to manage the extraneous load first.
Precisely. Their research in geometry supported this interaction. High variability was more effective when combined with formats that reduced extraneous load, like worked examples, compared to when used with conventional problem-solving tasks that might impose higher extraneous load on novices.
So the key insight is, first, minimize the unnecessary mental clutter with good instructional design. Then strategically introduce variability to help learners develop deeper, more flexible understanding that transfers.
Exactly. This perspective also has implications for sequencing tasks. The common approach is simple to complex. But cognitive load theory suggests that if we minimize extraneous load effectively, using worked examples, etc., then a more randomized or varied sequence, even early on, might actually be more effective for long-term learning and transfer.
Even if it feels harder initially.
Potentially, yes. The crucial element is managing that overall cognitive load so the increased germane load from variability doesn't push the total load beyond working memory limits.
This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into cognitive load theory. It's remarkable how understanding these fundamental principles of how our minds process information can have such profound and, well, practical implications for how we approach learning and designing instruction.
Absolutely. To briefly summarize the core ideas, we've seen how learning is fundamentally shaped by our cognitive architecture, particularly the limited capacity of working memory and the critical role of long-term memory storing knowledge as schemas.
Right.
And effective instructional design, guided by cognitive load theory, focuses on minimizing extraneous load, the wasted mental effort, and strategically managing germane load, the productive effort to optimize the whole learning process.
So for you, the listener, grasping these principles isn't just, an abstract academic exercise. It can really empower you to become a more effective and efficient learner. By understanding how your own cognitive architecture works and what factors can overload or support it, you can start to critically evaluate how information is presented to you, whether it's in school, training, or even just daily news consumption.
And this leads to a really important question for you to ponder after our deep dive today. Consider the various learning experiences you've had throughout your life, both the ones that felt really effective and those where you struggled. maybe despite putting in significant effort.
Hmm.
Can you now identify instances where these cognitive load principles might have been at play? Were there times when poorly designed materials or methods imposed unnecessary extraneous load, hindering your understanding?
Or maybe the opposite.
Inversely,
Yeah.
can you recall situations where a particular approach effectively supported your knowledge construction? Reflecting on your own learning journey through this lens, it can provide valuable insights into how you learn best and how you might approach future learning challenges with a more informed and strategic mindset.